Hey there, and welcome. It's my first video on this channel ever, so let me introduce myself. I'm not a politician, not a military expert, or a representative of a mass media. I'm Anton and I'm from Ukraine, born and grown up in the city of Kharkiv and living in Kyiv now. The war for me personally began at February 24th night from explosions of Iskander heavy ballistic rockets just 2 kilometers from my house. From February 27, aside from helping the local territorial defense, I started to make a daily update post with the news about the war on my main channel, the course of the battles, sanctions, and so on. A first-person information from inside the country, sorted and translated into the laconic posts for my international community. My main channel has nothing to do with the war or politics at all, but I saw this as something as someone who is not suitable for the military service, can and should do, aside from physical help on the place and donations, to raise the awareness. After some time, it turned into a decent chronicle. I left a link to this chronicle in the video description below, by the way, if you want to read it from the day one. And I realized that there is a strong demand on such kind of scenes and news in the western part of the internet. And so I'm here to not just release the news updates, but also to release the thoughts accumulated. You may notice some cuts in the video. That's because all my content before was made as a pre-recorded script, so talking in one breath is new to me somewhat, and I will cut some of the noticeably stuttery moments, etc. Plus, I may take a break in recording because of yet another Russian air raid. They happen from 2 to 10 times a day. Lastly, I'll be mentioning certain amount of historical events or terms as a part of my such chain. It's absolutely normal that not all of them will be sounding familiar to you, so I will leave links to a basic Wikipedia pages on them in the video description as well, for those who want to understand more.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
Dear QAnon fans, if any of you are watching this video, despite this section title looking like hinting something, I must inform you that this video will not contain any conspiracy theories. I'm sorry. Together with the compliance of all the basic human rights, selection of government in a transparent way, and the freedom of speech, another fundamental slice of democracy is truth. Truth in citizens filling their tax reports, truth in social relationships, and truth in how government addresses the people and explains their initiatives. After the victory of the West in the Cold War and collapse of USSR in 1991, political writer and philosopher Francis Fukuyama said, "The end of history doesn't need the historical figures." Yeah, he also stated that no totalitarianism will exist ever again on the world too, but this exact statement turned out to predict the future quite well. From this time, in most of democratic Western countries and especially in Europe, a same type of politicians came and remained at power no matter the change of parliament or president. To maintain the state of main task of a European is to sip tasty coffee without worrying about their life. In such conditions, governments more or less decided that, okay, we're still on this track, but here and there we definitely know better than the people of how to direct it. We know better for the people's sake, of course. We don't want to stress them too much with the bad news, we don't want to explain them too much, to not burden them. And for some reason, politicians became sure that people are not able to be responsible for choosing anything besides the flavor of a croissant and the political party to lead the country for the next 5 years. When there is a problem, don't even mention it. When there is a disaster already, call it a problem and tell there is nothing to worry about. doing what you think is better. This approach is clearly visible in almost everything, from economy to healthcare and geopolitics. In geopolitics, it's Yugoslav and Chechen wars, Rwandan genocide, Syrian war, and almost a complete neglect, toothlessness of Europe in this matter. And then Europe struggles with the refugee crisis and being a complete surprise Pikachu about it. In economy and healthcare, much noticeable in the US by the way, it's problems with inflation, homelessness, and prices on healthcare itself. Hey, so there is an inflation going on, right? What we as government could possibly do? We can address the people in form of open discourse, explain, at least on fingers, why the situation happened and what are the different options to deal with it. After that, possibly to launch some nationwide polls and at least partially take their results into account. Or we can just do what we think is better in short term now, tell people not to worry and call it a day. It will bite whole country in the butt cheeks 10 years later, but hey, most likely we will be not in the office by then. As for the Russian invasion to Ukraine, no leader in the civilized world has any doubts by now. It's no longer just about Ukraine, it's about whole Europe with a world impact. One may not care about Ukrainians, their lives and freedom, but one will care when the prices on beer, donuts, oil and basically every agricultural product will skyrocket. Because it turned out that Ukraine feeds slightly over 400 million people all around the world, especially in poorest countries. Global famine will cause chaos in those countries and, as a result, even worse refugee crisis. And where all those refugees will possibly go? While the developed countries has absolutely zero issues with this already, right? I'm not even mentioning 5 million of Ukrainians that already escaped the war to Europe. You definitely should act when there is a war at your doorstep, right? But you can call it a conflict, and then it becomes something more blurred, something more distant. And hey, it's a conflict, right? So both sides did something wrong. They just having their own beef settled, so why should we bother? The half-truths about calling war a war already costed dozens, thousands lives of Ukrainians and dozens, if not hundreds, billions of dollars to the West because they did nothing for so long and tried to do diplomacy with a state and nation which only understands force. It is incredibly simple. Even if you don't personally care about Ukraine, the sooner Russian imperial machine will be defeated, the sooner this cherished peace and stability will take place again and you will return to your croissant. But what is even simpler, if the West would be not calling the biggest continental war in Europe since the World War II a conflict for 8 years, just a reminder that Russian invasion to Ukraine began in 2014 from the annexion of Crimea and partial occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, also called Donbas together. If the West would impose the adequate sanctions for the annexion of Crimea and Donbas back in those years, the scale of crisis today would be much smaller. The West became soft, indecisive, and grew a habit to completely ignore problems till the moment they explode. This began 30 years ago and still exists now, because at least 3 generations of politicians were raised in the same way in the West, in the atmosphere of prosperity and stability, where such global problems as wars is taken as something distant, non-affecting. Because it is comfortable to call an invasion, genocide, a conflict, but suddenly it turns out removing genocide from the world, Germany in past, many developing countries today, it didn't work. But not because Hitler reincarnated in Germany now, no. It came out from a country which was named a partner for 20 years, and it is right here, right now, in Bucha and Mariupol in those mass graves. Such scenes, they just don't pop out of nowhere instantly, which means something was super wrong at the very ground base of the political course of the world leaders all this time. You can be not honest with your people for a month, a year, but when it lasts for a decade, people are not that much naive. And this half-truth practice is one of the major reasons why many people in democratic world are attracted to the authoritarian countries like China and Russia. They don't know all the details, they don't know the reality of tyranny, simply because their generation never experienced it. But they look on them and think, well, yes, they have problems with this and that, but hey, at least they are honest in this. This, in turn, reflects in people voting for the political parties which associate with those honest strong hand for them, which is often the alt-right parties directly or indirectly financed by authoritarian regimes to have own influence inside the democratic world. As a Ukrainian, it's hard to just throw away my personal feelings on the matter, but if to actually do so, it is clear that in some sense, this is not a fault of current Western leaders globally. They were born, nurtured, and worked for many years already in a world where such things as peace and prosperity were taken as granted. But the simple reality check shows they never were, and still aren't. The evil can always rise its head again. The global problems can and will appear again, and often, and you have to be ready to protect the peace today, so your children won't have to suffer. The politics of half-truths is always simple and looking better in a short time span, but with always much worse accumulating consequences later on. And this has to change.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
Any kind of system cannot last eternally and moreover thrive without updates and efficiency checkups. It's like a training program in a gym when if you want to gain some muscle mass, you have to update it from time to time, or your muscles will simply get used to the same load and will stop growing. A stress test is the best checkup for a system, and there is no more stronger one than a full-scale continental war involving 140 million population nation. This stress test was not only about Russian invasion though. The latest pandemic also showed the inability of the West to act united and act fast in the face of a global threat. It took months to acknowledge the issue, because countries were afraid of losing money due to flights and sea routes issues, but in the end it costed them so much more, as they have to do it anyway, but in larger scale. Those restrictions collapsed the world economy much harder than the vaccines and their ridiculously unfair distribution around the world, where some countries began to hoard them so much that few months after millions of doses were simply thrown out, while the poorest countries sometimes didn't have any at all. And so eventually, after weeks and months, the new outbreaks were happening again, because it's naive to think that you can actually block the flow of people all around the world on 100%. The West was lecturing Ukraine and many other developing countries about democracy, about the importance of freedom, about the will to do something for those. But when a real test arrived in the form of a global threat to freedom and security as whole, large part of the West, aside from some countries who showed a strong and clear position from the first day, such as United States, Great Britain, Poland, Czech Republic and Baltic states, simply shown that they are not ready to stand up for the values they were proud about so much and for so long. And so for almost 3 months in the war, even after the mass graves with thousands of people buried in them in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol were shown to the whole world, even when Putin just dropped the mask and started openly talking that Russia is doing nothing else but the expanding of the empire. Many countries still wanted to be diplomatic with the aggressor, already in the middle of a war. Purely on paper, those proposals are correct and have sense, but only when the subject of this diplomacy is between two civilized states, not when trying to talk to an invading autocratic regime. You don't try to talk out the crocodile that's chewing your leg already. You fight for your life. On practice, major organizations founded by the West, be it the United Nations, NATO, or the European Union, under this stress test, showed they are stuck inside the eternal, "we are deeply, deeply concerned, but hey, let's all make peace" kind of bubble, but doing not much of the needed or in the so ridiculously long time, while both global external and smaller internal threats remain unsolved. Somewhere in April or so, our diplomats mentioned that the world leaders and government officials were saying, no, you cannot do diplomacy like this. You can't just say things straight. There are protocols, intermediary terms. Sorry, but your approach has fallen short to protect what you value, and the world now needs to rethink its approach to many things, diplomacy included. It is important to notice that I'm not talking about populism here, but such seemingly simple things as to call the events around exactly as they are became a long-forgotten skill for a majority of Western governments. Yet, the change happens anyway, because as much as tankies would whine about democracy while simping for a strong hand like Putin, it works. If a certain government doesn't care about the problem itself, it has no choice but to care about position of its people. And since the war began, the polls in most of European countries, United States and other major large countries were clearly showing their people see Russia as an aggressor. They endorse the sanctions, they support the weapons supply to Ukraine. Because even if politicians don't want to accept this, people already see it. When their own countries are acting weak in the face of a global threat, Ukrainians are fighting it with their blood, fighting for the rest of the world. And if such government happen to ignore that, this will almost ensure that their own voters will highly likely not vote for them again. The change is what keeping democracy alive, and that's exactly what's happening right now. In the US, for instance, all the initiatives related to Ukraine support received almost unanimous bipartisan voting in the Senate, and that's now during one of the worst internal divisions in US history. Germany, which has own terribly painful story with Nazism and genocide, Germany with its never again principle, Germany, which basically doesn't have own army. So much it hates to be associated with the war in any context. Just think it through. Germany, that had the biggest pacifism politics in the last 80 years, is sending us heavy offensive weapons. It's a colossal distance they sprinted in just 3 months. As Ukrainian, it was incredibly annoying for me to see all the delays at first, but with the German mentality and history taken into account, both German government and nation deserve nothing but respect. Switzerland, which didn't impose sanctions against the Nazi Germany during World War II, but imposed them now against Russia. Yep, just like that. The democracy now is on the crossroads not seen since the World War II. Either keep the methods and politics that have worked before and receive the Russia stage illusion of peace for a very short time, but lose integrity, unity, more territory and more money, and probably just lose everything in the end. Or remember the ideals it fought for centuries before, go through, yes, a tough change, but preserve itself and become stronger and ensure the respect and votings of own people. Pressing a stop button to a half-truth politics, reacting on threats faster, and most importantly, acting united with own people and other countries if the threat is global, and not seeing peace and prosperity as something granted. And this choice has been made already, slowly but surely, one after another, overcoming the fear and the comfort bubbles the croissant diplomats turn into historical figures again, becoming leaders which can stand up for what they value.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
For decades, people outside Europe were not much aware about Ukrainian and Slavic culture in general, because they were seeing Slavic and Russian cultures as the same thing. This happened because Russians were stealing and appropriating Ukrainian, Belarusian, Polish cultures as their own, imposing as the mother of Slavic folk, while practically just stealing other Slavic nations' cultural feats from language to jokes and even cooking. But aside from that, the today's reality of Russian culture in its practical manifestation, it has such a ridiculous level of state propaganda binded so deeply to the nation that the culture just loses itself and becomes nothing but a continuation of Russian war machine. Imperialistic mindset, chauvinism, and the cult of death became the culture. Unfortunately, majority of the nation is buried deeply in a never-ending nostalgia for the 18th century and the Soviet period. But the thing is, Russia doesn't want to just build this dream for themselves. They want to bring it to the world and have no problems with doing genocide in the process. All those memes and the positive image about a funny Russian fellow we just want to drink vodka and dance with a beer turned out to be yet another weapon of Russian propaganda on the international arena, meant to hide the cultural stagnation and a chauvinistic mindset. And this culture is crumbling now. While initially Russian propaganda covered a huge part of Western audience, today everything that Russian officials and even top persons like Putin, Lavrov, Peskov, etc. are stating every day is not believed by the majority of the people outside of Russia. The goals of the special military operation change every 2 weeks. Either it's the liberation of people of Donbas from the Nazis, or the destruction of American-centered world, or the war with the anti-Russian NATO coalition, or something else. These statements has become the asylum mumbling. Now a short pause. When I mentioned asylum, I meant it. Just a few days ago, Minister of Defense of Russia officially stated that necromancers are fighting for Ukrainian forces. No, I'm not kidding. Citing the Russian MOD, Kiev decided to raise the dead from the graves and test the inhabitants of Odessa with the plague. You can read it yourself, I left a link below. This delirium is now targeting only Russians themselves to feed their illusory bubble some of the most indoctrinated tankies and the poorest countries in Africa, which are getting humanitarian aid from Russia in form of stolen Ukrainian grain. The Russians will believe anything, anytime, anyway, and the latter ones, they don't care much about such a distant thing as a war in Ukraine there from Africa. They only need the help itself. No matter how serious faces Russian officials make, they are not believed neither in the West or in the East. This is a disintegration of Russian politics into mouthpieces of which tens or maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars were invested during the years of the regime. The culture of Ukraine is everything but the opposite to this. Ukrainians don't simp for the past, but look into the future. Ukraine don't hold historical grudges, but overcomes them and builds new future with nations around. We had a lot of bloody conflicts with Poland in past, for example, but look at us now. If one is about to describe Ukrainian culture in a single word, that would be Voля. The word will in Ukrainian sounds as Voля and has 3 meanings. The first one is the same as its English translation, a will, determination. The second one, though, means freedom. Another prominent part of Ukrainian culture is unity over everything if needed. Many major Western countries here and there are going through the periods of a massive polarization of society, which wastes the insane amount of energy on internal quarrels. United States, France, and some others, leading countries of the democratic world, are struggling with society crises that can spill out their borders. But in Ukraine, the mentioned national-scale will also fuels the absolutely incredible level of self-organization, the ability to unite when needed in a blink of an eye, a love to freedom and a strong will to achieve and preserve this freedom no matter when, in peaceful or turbulent times. A resolve which Europe lacks after a decades-lasting period of comfort preservation. When the first explosions began near 5 a.m. at February 24th, we understood. They came to erase us from the face of Earth. Everything else immediately became unimportant. Past quarrels, personal plans, and any of such kind material things. On some subconscious level, each of us just understood what to do. Take responsibility, take and do. And everyone took it, not because of the order, but because in Ukraine it just can't be otherwise. Ukrainians, reminder that average salary here is around $250, helped volunteers to raise $20 million to buy 4 Bayraktar drones for the army. This was also greatly demonstrated during our revolution back in 2014. Tremendous self-organization and the spirit of freedom that just hovered over the square and Ukraine as a whole. And this spirit attracted others. People from different corners of the globe came to Maidan and broadcasted what was happening far and beyond. And the first victims of our ex-president snipers were Armenian and Belarusian. And now people from over 40 countries are fighting alongside Ukrainian soldiers in the International Legion. Centuries ago at Zaporizhzhia Sich, the homeland of Ukrainian Cossacks, those who joined were not asked for nationality, social status, or religious affiliation. People came there to share and protect the way of life they believed into, and that's what's happening again here. The last meaning of the word Voля means a conscious inclination towards some goal or desire. We can say it's a never-ending dreaming of better, always living with a goal. Now people are watching Ukrainian spirit from outside or joining us here, but after the victory, Ukraine will share this will to the world around. The truly unique ability to unite, the love to freedom and better tomorrow, and the will to overcome any odds. The will as the way of life. That's Ukrainian proposal for the civilization. And that's not some kind of abstract thing, yet nothing else but a practical feat of the nation which we will happily share with others.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
First, it's real. Many countries and cultures have great events, great deeds, great transformations done. But as it goes with life, for many of them it's a part of their history by now, and it's normal. The heroism, the struggle for freedom, the will to victory and improvement, all that Ukraine shows just now in real time. It's a 24/7 stream of a nation going through events which now mostly can be read about or seen only in movies or books. The battles won against all odds, the national unity like nowhere else. The defense of Mariupol alone is a battle of Thermopylae of a modern era, which will be surely studied in history books generations after. Ukraine changes the rules of the game, for diplomacy, for military conflicts, for crisis control, and doing it right here, right now. Ukrainian culture reflects these events and the will of a nation, in art, songs, and even memes. Add a Ukrainian language, which is considered one of the most melodic languages in the world by most of linguistic organizations all around the world, and you'll get a cultural cocktail which is exploding exponentially. Dreaming of great things, but keeping the cold head. Despite all the terrible challenges history gave us in past and giving us now, Ukrainians as a nation keeps a cold head and builds its future based on its wishes, not on the traumas or grudges. No matter how much Russian propaganda and some of mainstream Western media, which journalists usually never were in Ukraine to begin with, are trying to seek those mythical Nazis controlling Ukraine, Ukrainians hate the radical movements more than anyone else, despite all the background which would suggest otherwise. Just a reminder, Russian invasion began from annexion of Crimea and partial occupation of Donbas region back in February 2014. And right before that, we went through a goddamn revolution which swept whole country. After that, it's only expected to see the rise of influence of radical nationalist movement and political parties, right? But know what? Our most noticeable far-right candidate gained less than 1% of votes at presidential election back in 2014. And other, we can say so, somewhat right conservative candidate gained slightly more than 1%. Now elections in 2019, already 5 years into Russian aggression and several thousand killed Ukrainians. You know how much far-right candidates gained this time? 0.5%. Yeah, twice less than 1%. And that's so much for far-right influence in Ukraine. You can check out this data yourself on Wikipedia, by the way. And meanwhile, the actual alt-right candidate in a center of democratic Europe in France gains almost 25% of votes during the first tour. In the first days of the invasion of Russian troops, tens of thousands of guns were freely distributed to the Territorial Defense Squad. You can call it the firearms-equipped militia. And with such huge amount of guns instantly appeared in people's hands, no cases of shootings between people happened. Even now, after the Russian genocide seen in Bucha, Borodyanka, Mariupol, and many other settlements and regions, after seeing their children, wives and friends tortured, raped and murdered like a cattle, Ukrainians still stick to the rules of war, treat Russian prisoners of war properly and do not attack Russian settlements in return, while we do have a military needs for that. We remain humans before everything, even in darkest hours.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
IT industry, mobile applications and internet banking on level higher than in US or any European country. No, I didn't mean a joke here. Just imagine, there is a war in Ukraine which covers large part of our territory as a literal war zone, and the rest of the territory lives under constant rocket attacks threat. Infrastructure and economy are severely damaged, millions of people lost their work and had to relocate elsewhere, etc. And despite this, Ukrainians are still able to pay taxes, electricity bills, send and register documents for whatever needs. All this from a single app online in a few clicks. Whereas other applications like the interactive map of air raids, refugee applications and documents, and many others were created in mere days or sometimes even hours to serve the people. Every time I tell my friends from Germany, UK, Canada, United States, etc. that I can create an online invoice with my friends to split a bar bill exactly how we need it in like 10 seconds and pay it in another 5 seconds, they usually don't believe me. Then I'm showing how it's done. Another example is the war itself. From official report of Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, around 15 to 20% of all destroyed Russian tanks and APCs were fried thanks to GPS coordinates sent by common Ukrainians through a Telegram chatbot. It goes like that. Russian tank column approaches or enters some Ukrainian village to rest and resupply there and then maybe move towards some nearby town. Some of the locals see that, make a quick photo with their phone and sends it together with the GPS coordinates to Ukraine Security Service in a chatbot via the messenger. Security Service sends a scout or a drone to the place, and if it confirms the invader's location, data then goes to Ukraine Armored Forces HQ, which sends aviation or artillery to do the job. The whole process sometimes happened in a matter of minutes. Ukraine became a center of an IT industry in Europe already a few years before, and with all the investments from European Union and the rest of the world, this will only grow. Ukrainian programmers and startups are being rewarded for creativity here and there almost every month. We have a tremendous experience with all kinds of applications and IT projects that can improve the experience in many areas of government and private sectors and greatly reduce bureaucracy, even for the most developed first world countries. Endless export of agricultures. Already now, Ukraine feeds slightly more than 400 million people all around the globe. You may not even know this, but there is a large chance that the grain or oil in a donut, grilled steak, or salad you're eating now came from Ukraine. With the inflow of investors and new technologies, Ukraine can build up this export and its efficiency to feed even more people and make prices on any food containing agriculture cheaper for everyone. Cheap electricity. Ukraine has a lot of excess electricity generation, which it began to sell to Europe already now, during the war. Alternative energy production sources also grow with every month in Ukraine, which means electricity export capabilities also will only grow.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
From all the geopolitical arena players, and Russia is still such, no matter how I wouldn't want so, Russia is the state which embodies regression more than any other. Even China, where the ruling regime and society structure is anything but opposite to democracy and freedom, still invests huge amount of money into global progress, green energy, medicine, computer and space technologies, you name it. Contrary to this, Russia is purely military state where the economy and production themselves are built around the war machine. The size of a total Russian budget itself being just a bit bigger than a budget of a single state of California in US, while having a population over 140 million people makes it even worse empirically. In advance, answering the possible argument of some viewers, no way! I have been to or seen Moscow and St. Petersburg, they look better than most of European capitals. That's the thing here. Thinking that Moscow and St. Petersburg are example of Russian level of life is an extreme fallacy. Moscow and Petersburg alone receive over 15% of total Russian budget. Russia almost entirely consists of rural areas and medium small sized towns, majority of which don't even have roads, and around half of the country doesn't have access to gas, which is extremely ironic as Russia is the world's biggest gas exporter. All those photos and videos you probably saw in the internet where Russian soldiers steal not just gaming consoles or phones, but washing machines, toilets, dishes, and even wooden doghouses from Ukrainian settlements. That's the reality of an average Russian. Practically, the Russia state in average is living somewhere in 19th century, while the rest of developed and developing world at least tries to go to the 21st one. Humanity is about to produce vaccines against cancer and HIV, colonize Mars, we have VR hentai, electric cars and hoverboards, and reducing the borders and taxes between countries every year to make travels and trading easier. But on the other hand, we have a country which stopped in its technological and cultural development so badly that half of its population don't have a goddamn toilets in their houses. Yes, there are a lot of poorest countries in the world which have the same level of development today as well, but the difference between them is they do not try to start a continental war and blackmail half of the world with a fossil fuel. In its current state, Russia is simply not able to contribute anything valuable to the general progression of humanity, and with its aggressive imperialistic ambitions and terrorist actions, it only drags humanity back, which is incredibly sad because the huge potential of Russia could turn into the one of, if not the biggest, world progress leaders long ago, should it choose a different political and cultural course. At the same time, the never-before-seen sanctions as a reply to Russian invasion and genocide will speed up the global progress, because even already at the current level of sanctions, Europe clearly stepped on a way to completely give up on Russian fossils, gas, oil and coal. This process will take some time, of course, but sometimes that would naturally take like 15, 20 or even more years, will now take from a few months to a 5-10 years, depending on the country, of course. Yes, some countries will use this moment and buy those fossils with discounts from Russia even under the sanctions. But the Russian export will never be same again. With a player that was number 1 gas and number 3 oil exporter in the world completely out of the market of developed countries, the global process of abandoning the fossil fuels and transitioning to alternative energy will speed up even more.
Доброго вечора, ми з України.
The Russian full-scale war and genocide against Ukraine made the world finally recognize Russian politics as a global threat. This war opened all the problems and abscesses in the established politics and approaches of the developed countries that didn't change for decades since the Cold War, problems which many countries and leaders tried to ignore. After a long-going era of a half-truth and a preservation of comfort over everything, the measured delusion of most of the Western politicians and leaders, and the reason of their hesitation to support Ukraine at the beginning of this war, was that they thought should they deal with the Russian regime again, they can turn the world back to the state before the war. But this invasion already crumbled too many principles and dogmas. Genocide in the middle of Europe and the 21st century, never before seen cyber attacks, blackmail with a fossil fuel, and a global famine as a terrorist weapons. And that's not a full list of Russian achievements. Not instantly, but surely, it became clear that the world will never be the same, no matter what, and many standards in global security, diplomacy, and most importantly, a resolve to stand up for peace must be re-evaluated, or just completely reinvented from scratch. 4 months ago, we were given 72 hours to fall, expressed condolences, and offered to accept the new reality. Now though, countries all around the world directly say, we will support Ukraine until its complete victory, and nothing else, because courage is contagious, and we're bringing the courage pandemic to the world. 4 months ago, a wild Russian concentration camp, intoxicated by its own cannibalistic propaganda, declared a war on a democratic world. If we had to describe this period, it would be a time to say goodbye to all the illusions and simply see who is who. And after some time of painful hesitation, most of nations of a free world made their choice. A tough choice for many, yes, but they turned the bright page of history. Ukrainians have shown that there is an abyss of civilization between us and Russia. We chose the path of freedom, and the Russian state has become the largest terrorist organization in the world. This war launched the initiation of Ukraine as a nation which stopped being a backyard player, both from the view of the world and in our own view. We are no longer looking for answers to our neighbors on questions about our identity, looking at neither Europe or Russia. We firmly know that we are the part of a European democratic family and the bearers of the values of a free world, but we are Ukrainians as well. The Russian invasion to Ukraine is bringing the end to the era where mythical stability was something to maintain over everything, even the freedom and peace themselves, the factors that build stability in first place. The offer of stability over anything else and fear of change shackles both common people and politicians and gives a remote control from a TV or a social network group. There you can dispel boredom, compensate for the desire to go beyond your own horizon, but in no case go anywhere further than standing on the place. And as government or nation as whole, to develop yourself further as a part of mankind. Ukraine has a lot to learn from more economically and low-developed countries for sure, but at the same time, on top of more material things like agricultural, electrical and IT contribution to the rest of the world, globally, Ukraine can bring a more honest, effective view on solutions to global problems and refresh the understanding of freedom and unity to the nations both West and East. After winning the war, having defended the right to freely build our own lives, we can export this to the world. The export of will to the world is Ukrainian contribution to the development of mankind. Any person in the world spends a huge amount of energy fighting their own fears every day. By deploying this potential into curiosity and the will to stand up for your future every day, we can achieve unimaginable. And this is what we fight for, not just the victory in the war itself, but the world that is better than before it, and knowing how deeply our enemy slows down the overall progress of humanity, better world for everyone, not just the Ukraine. About the war on my main channel. The course of the from February 27 that the culture loses itself and becomes nothing but a continuation of this propaganda, of this war machine. In economy and healthcare, or we can do what just, or and everyone took it, not because of the order, but simply it can't be otherwise in Ukraine.